Hey everybody, how you doing? This is about to be a really fun video. What we're talking about in this video, 300 Win Mag, sighted in at 200 yards, and I'm going to go over some drop tables, show you the different distances, also the dials for your optic in mils and MOA, if you are sighted in at 200 yards with your 300 Win Mag, and we're going to talk about a couple different types of ammo and the different drops between them. But I sight in everything at 100 yards. Two reasons. One, where I have access to sight things in is 100 yards. I don't have a good range near me, within close, short driving distance where I can sight things in at 200 yards. Secondly, all the places that I have access to deer hunt, we're taking deer at like 30, 40 yards max. So there's zero reason for me to sight things in at 200 yards. Now, you guys out west tell me all the time, I sight in at 200 yards. Some people even further than that. Well, I was in Utah last week mule deer hunting. I got an awesome mule deer on the ground. It was a 430 yard shot and had an incredible time. But I was sitting around, while you're there, learn from the experts. I asked the guides that were all sitting around and said, hey, what do you guys sight in at out here? And every single one of them said they sight in at 200 yards. But their shots are averaging like 400 yards out there. So it makes a little more sense to sight it in a little bit further. Let's dig into the numbers and kind of see what happens. If you sight in at 100 yards, stay tuned. I'm going to put that information at the end of the video, and we're going to talk about drop if you sight in your deer catcher 300 Win Mag at 100 yards. I'll put that at the end of the video. But focus of this video, we're talking about 200 yards sight in. And we're going to focus in on two different loadings from Remington. The Remington Core Locked 150 grain PSP, and then the 300 Win Mag 180 grain Core Lock tipped. So, this stuff, let's start with this. You can pretty much find this stuff at any Walmart or any sporting goods stuff place near you. The Remington Core Locked. Some of the most common ammo out there. So let's focus in on the numbers here real quick. Also, let me make note here. I've calculated these numbers using somewhat out west weather at an elevation of 6,000 feet above sea level and at 50 degrees. If your altitude is drastically different than 6,000 feet above sea level, that can affect these numbers. If you're pretty close to 6,000 and within 1,000, it's probably not going to affect it too much. But just for sake of letting you know, that's what I did. These numbers was 6,000 feet above sea level. Let's look at these charts here. So if you look at this first column, that's the yardage of the target or the deer per se. The second column is the drop in inches. You can see at 200 yards, it's 0. That means we're sighted in at 0. So if you look at that second column, if we're sighted in at 0, or at 200 with this stuff, at 300, we have almost a 6-inch drop. So if you sight in at 200 with this stuff, you see a deer at 300, you can hold 6 inches high, which essentially you could hold the spine area, still hold on the deer, and then you're going to drop 6 inches at 300, hit heart, shoulder, lungs, or go over one column. If your optic is in MOA at 300, is 1.84 MOA, so you probably go to 7 clicks, 1.75 MOA, then hold that on where you want to hit. Pooh! Or the mils column, if you're sighted in at 200 and your deer is at 300, it's 0.54 mils. So, point kind of being, if you're sighted in at 200, a deer pops up at 100, well, that second column there, you're only 1 inch off. So you could still hold dead on at 100 yards on the deer. 1 inch off. Their heart and their lungs is much bigger than 1 inch. And then at 300, if you're sighted in at 200, it's only dropping 6 inches. And then, if you're already sighted in at 200, you're also having to dial less for further distances. But really, the main difference is if you're doing holdover, you're sighted in at 200 yards. Further out there, you can hit them at 100, only 6 inches off at 300. If you're going to dial, you're going to dial. But if you're sighted in at 200, you're going to dial less. So here are the numbers. If you got this stuff, the BC on this is 0.294. Pretty common stuff. 150 grain lead nose. If you got another 150 grain lead nose, the numbers will probably match pretty close to this, 300 Win Mag. Now, let's talk about this stuff. The Remington Core Lock tipped. Switch over to the page. All the data is the same, 6,000 feet of elevation, but the BC on this is 0.481 on the G1 scale. It's got a higher BC. So let's look at these numbers quick. Again, second column there, zeroed at 200 yards. Then at 300, this says this is dropping. Again, pretty near 6 inches. It's 180 grain. It's heavier, but it's got a higher BC. So, when we get out to distance, it's going to start to drop less than this stuff. Across that, at 300 yards, you're going to dial 2 MOA if you got this stuff. If you're in mils, 0.59 mils, so 0.6 mils at 300. 400 yards, 1.5 foot drop. MOA is 4.35 mils, 1.26. Again, we're talking about the Core Lock tipped. But you can see there, if you're sighted in with this, 400, 1.5 foot. If holdovers is your thing, most people have a pretty good sense of what a 1.5 foot drop is. So at that point, you'd probably be aiming like that far over the deer's back. If you're not somebody who likes to do the dials and stuff, if you just like to pull up quick, hold over, it's simpler than trying to remember, you know, when that deer comes up, oh, it's 427 yards. Well, how many clicks is that? If you like holding over, well, sighting in at 200 makes more sense if you're out west. Makes complete sense. But you can go down. These numbers are good, guys. For 6,000 feet of elevation, you can go back in the video, freeze it for the core locked 150 grain, and then the core lock tipped 180 grain. Again, we're talking about 200 yard zeros. If you're out west, it makes more sense. It makes more sense. For my deer, at 430 yards, again with a 100 yard zero, I dialed 1.4 mils. Got him. Now, I've got some footage where we talked about 100 yard zero with 300 Win Mag and the boot lock drop. Let me put this footage in right here if you like to sight in at 100. We are talking about 300 Win Mag. If you go to the channel, I have a video series on boot lock drop. And what that is I sight everything in at 100 yards. I know some of you guys out west like to sight things in at 200, 300 yards. I do everything at 100 yards, and then I know the drop and the dials for the specific loading. So I've got a video series going across as many cartridges as possible. Everything from 17 HMR all the way up to 50 BMG. We've done tons of them. What I realized, I haven't done that for 300 Win Mag. I just got a new 300 Win Mag. So I'm making this boot lock drop video. One, for me, so when I need the data, I can just pull up this video and screenshot it, and I'll have my dope living on the interwebs. Piece of cake for me, but also for you, if you are a 300 Win Mag fan, and if you don't know how to do the calculations, or simply just like me, you want to have a free copy of it on the internet, you can look up at any time. That's what we're doing here today. And I'm going to show you across 5 different loadings. So if you don't have the exact ammo, one of yours is probably pretty close to this, and you'll have a very good starting point. Let's jump right into it. So, I am a fan of the Remington ammunitions. So, what I'm going to show you is 5 different Remington loadings today. And then I'm going to show you a drop chart. And we'll have all the data. I'll have all the data. You'll have all the data. If you want to know how I do this, I have a video called something like boot lock drop for beginners. Actually, it's called long range for beginners. Type in WHOTEEWHO long range for beginners, and it'll pop right up. And I go into detail how I do this. But today, we're going over 5 different Remington loads. And I'm going to start off slow explaining, then I'm going to go through it quick because you'll know what I'm talking about. The first one, Remington Core Lock tipped for the 300 Win Mag. Remington loads at 180 grain bullet. You can see here on the chart, the BC is .481. Bullet weight, 180 grains. Initial velocity, 2980. Now, first column is the range. Second is elevation. You'll see at 100 yards, it's 0 because I sight everything in at 100 yards. And then that second column, a -3 at 200. That means at 200 yards, if you sighted that in at 100, it would drop 3 inches. So if you were target practicing or deer hunting, you would need to hold 3 inches high of where you want it to hit. That's what that means. So on and so forth, 300, 400 yards, all that going down. Now that's if you're wanting to just hold over, right? The third column is MOA elevation. If you have an MOA scope, at 200 yards, you would need to dial that baby to 1.4 and then hold dead on and send it. So on and so forth for MOA. At 500 yards, you need to dial that baby to 8.9-ish. 8.75 or just 9, whatever. And then same story goes for mils. I tend to lean towards mils if I have the choice. For 300 yards, dial it for 1 mils, hold dead on, and send it. So on and so forth. And I have all this data for that 180 grain Remington core locked, almost 3,000 feet per second. You can use all those dials. You can notice that this round goes subsonic after 1,200 yards. Something to note. Now that was the 180 grain core lock tipped. Those tipped, they're good hunting rounds. We've used them in several videos, and I'm a fan of them. Tipped, higher BC, good for long range stuff. And we've got proof that they take some deers. Now I'm going to run through these next ones a lot more quickly, but you and I will then have the data, and it'll be good. So the next one is Remington Core Locked 300 Win Mag 180 grain. So this is also a 180 grain going about the same speed, lower BC of .383. Again, you can freeze all this if you're trying to compare a different load and see which one's closest to yours. But this is 180 grain. You see it goes subsonic quicker in between 1,000 yards and 1,100 yards. And there's the same thing. The drop rate in inches, the dials for MOA and mils. Yeah. There's the 180 grain core locked data on bullet drop. Now we've got the 150 grain Remington core locked for 300 Win Mag. It has a lower BC of .294, but it's going faster, almost 3,300 feet per second. Let's pop up the numbers right there. It goes subsonic after 800 yards. Notice up close, the lighter one doesn't drop as much, drops 2.5 inches. And then we've got all our dials there for MOA and mils. Now we got the data. What's the fourth one we're talking about? The fourth one is Remington Premier Sirocco's, which I've had really good experience with those. High BC of a .507. It's a 180 grain going 2960 feet per second. So pop up all of the information right here, and we've got our drop. It stays supersonic till after 1,300 yards. Here is our drop. Elevation in MOA and mils. We got our dials there. 300 Win Mag, generally speaking, is pretty good for doing long range stuff. I will make mention for people doing holdovers. If you got a standard 3 to 9x40 scope, you don't do the whole turrets thing. You set it in at 100 yards, it's going to drop 3 inches pretty much at 200. And then 300 yards, depending on the load, 10 to 12 inches. So 300 yards, you're holding over a foot. 200 yards, you're holding over 3 inches. Past 300 yards, I don't recommend you doing holdover methods. At that point, you're just guessing, and that's unethical in my mind. If you're going to do something past that far, you need to be specific and detailed and knowledgeable with what you're doing and using those MOA or mill turrets if you're trying to do long range, especially if you're hunting. Now, if you're on steel, by all means, guess away as long as you're not being unsafe. But for hunting, got to have those dials. So there's all your information on those Sirocco's. And then the fifth one we're going to talk about here is Remington's new Premier long range. They announced it last year, and it is now out. It's Remington's newest load, the Premier long range. They're loading it in several calibers. High BC of .596 in the 190 grain, so it's heavier and has a high BC. It's going to be good for long range, 2885 feet per second. Check this out. Stays supersonic past 1,500 yards. Ballistically speaking, this is probably my favorite from the list. I haven't hunted with those loads yet, but we're going to do our best to here this season. Heavier, 190 grain. There's your drop. Like I said, 3 inches at 200, a foot or so at 300, and then we've got our MOA and our mill dials. But hey, appreciate you guys watching. Like I said, this is just as much for me to have the notes stored online, so I have my quick dials, I can look them up, as it is for you to have the same information. It's free, it didn't cost you nothing. And if you don't have one of these specific Remington loads, what you got in your bang bang boolite slinger, most assuredly something very close to one of these. But hey, appreciate y'all watching. Like I said, if 300 Win Mag isn't your jam, we've done this for almost everything that's out there. So definitely go check that out. Type in WHOTEEWHO, whatever your favorite is, 30-06, 308, 223. It's all online, and I've put this up there free for you guys to have access to. But hey guys, appreciate you watching and coming along with me talking about 300 Win Mag and the drop at different distances depending on where you sight it in. But hey, appreciate y'all watching. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you're signed up for the newsletter over at WHOTEEWHO.com, and make sure that you're following us everywhere else. We're doing giveaways, all kind of stuff. But hey, appreciate you guys watching. Truly means a lot. Let me know where you sight in your 300 Win Mag. Appreciate y'all. We'll see you on the next one. WHOTEEWHO!